My son betrayed me from money, but the truth changed everything. I was making coffee the morning I found the first document. Not the second one, not the one that broke me. Just the first one. The one that I almost threw away because I thought it was junk mail. A legal envelope sitting on my kitchen counter with my name printed on the front in that cold official font they use when something is about to turn your life upside down. I remember setting it next to my coffee mug. I remember looking out the window at the backyard while the coffee dripped. There was a cardinal sitting on the fence post near the old oak tree. I watched it for a while. I don't know why I remember that bird so clearly. Maybe because that was the last quiet moment I had for a very long time. My name is Ray Decker. I am 68 years old. I live alone now in a 2-bedroom apartment in Greenfield, Ohio, which is about 40 miles from the house where I raised my family. The house where my kids learned to walk and ride bikes and broke windows with footballs and dragged mud in from the yard. The house where my wife Sandra and I sat on the porch every summer evening for almost 30 years, watching the neighborhood slow down as the sun went low. That house is gone from me now. Not because I sold it. Not because I chose to leave. That story is what I am going to tell you. I want you to understand something before I start. I am not a perfect man. I never was.
I worked too much, and I was gone too often, and I missed things that a father should never miss. I missed school plays and swim meets, and there were birthdays where I called instead of showed up because the job wouldn't let me go. I am not telling you that to make excuses. I am telling you because I want you to know that what happened to me didn't happen to some saint. It happened to a regular man who loved his family the best way he knew how and thought that was enough. Thought that love was a kind of armor. Thought that if you worked hard enough and sacrificed enough and showed up when it really counted, then the people you loved would be there when you needed them. That's what I believed. For 60 years I believed that. I worked for Hendricks Construction for 31 years, started as a framing carpenter when I was 22 years old, worked my way up to site supervisor. Good, honest work, the kind that puts splinters in your hands and dust in your lungs, but also puts food on the table and shoes on 3 kids, and a roof that didn't leak and a furnace that always worked. Sandra worked too for a while. She was a dental hygienist for about 12 years before we decided one of us needed to be home more when the kids were young. So I doubled down, picked up weekend work when I could find it, did side jobs for neighbors and family friends, built a deck for my sister-in-law and never charged her a cent, rebuilt the foundation wall on my brother Dennis's house for the cost of materials. That's who I was. That's who I thought my family saw when they looked at me. My oldest is Kyle. He was 39 when all this started. He's my son from my first relationship before Sandra. I raised him as my own from the time he was 2 years old. His biological father was not in the picture, not even a footnote. I adopted Kyle legally when he was 5 and gave him my name, and he grew up calling me Dad, and I never for one single day thought of him as anything other than my son, my blood, my boy. We used to go fishing together every April down at Harlan Creek. I taught him to drive in the parking lot of the old abandoned Kmart on Route 27. I helped him move 4 times. I was at his wedding. I was at the hospital when his daughter was born, and I held that little girl for the first time and I cried like I hadn't cried since my own mother passed. Sandra and I had 2 kids together, Marcus, who was 34, and Jolene, who was 31. Good kids. They have their own lives now, which is how it should be. They live in different states. Marcus is out in Phoenix with his wife and 2 boys. Jolene is up in Portland. We talk. Not as much as I'd like, but we talk. They were on the edge of what happened, but not the center of it. The center was Kyle, and then Sandra, and then my brother Dennis, who I already mentioned. Those 3 people together make up the architecture of the worst 2 years of my life. But let me back up to the beginning of the end, which really began about 4 years ago, on a Tuesday in March, when Kyle called me and said he wanted to talk about my finances. He had been asking about my finances for a while by that point. Small questions at first. Do you have a will? Do you know what your property is worth? Have you ever thought about a trust?
I answered him honestly every time. Yes, I have a will. Sandra and I did it years ago with a lawyer downtown. The house goes to her, and after her, it splits between the kids. I hadn't thought much about updating it because I figured there was no rush. I was healthy. I still worked part-time consultation for Hendricks 2 or 3 days a week. I felt good. I had no reason to think about dying or asset protection or any of those things that feel more real at 75 than they do at 64. Kyle took me to lunch that March, the diner on Maple Street that we always went to, the one with the red vinyl booths and the waitress named Carol who has worked there since before Kyle was born and always remembers I take my coffee black. He ordered his usual, which was the Western omelet, and I got the short stack because I wasn't very hungry. We talked about regular things for a while. His daughter Emma, who was 9 at the time and playing soccer, his job at the distribution center where he'd been promoted to logistics manager, his wife Trish, who I liked fine, but who always seemed a little cool to me, a little watchful, the kind of person who is always calculating something, even when they smile. Then he got to it. He said he had been talking to a financial advisor, and the advisor said that given the current value of the house and my retirement savings and the way property transfer laws work in Ohio, I could save my family a significant amount of money in taxes and probate if I transferred ownership of the house into a family trust now rather than letting it go through the will. He said it was a common strategy. He said the advisor said a lot of families do it. He pulled out a folder he had brought with him and slid it across the table to me. I remember looking at that folder the same way I later looked at that legal envelope by the coffee maker, with a kind of calm that, in hindsight, was really just ignorance. I told him I would think about it. I told him I needed to talk to Sandra. He nodded and said of course, and picked up the check, which he almost never did, and drove me home. At the door, he hugged me and said he loved me, and I said, "I love you too, son." And I went inside and didn't think much about it for another couple of weeks. Looking back, I can see the machinery already turning. I just couldn't hear it yet. Sandra brought it up again about a month later, said Kyle had called her separately and explained the whole thing to her, and she thought it sounded sensible. Sandra was always practical about money, more practical than me. She kept the household budget for all those years with a ledger book and a cup of sharp pencils, and not a dollar went unaccounted for. She trusted numbers. She trusted plans. And she trusted Kyle in a way that sometimes felt excessive to me, but that I never said out loud because he was my son, and I wanted to believe that her trust in him was proof of what a good man he had grown into. So we went to the lawyer. Not our lawyer downtown where we had done the will. A new one. Kyle's recommendation. A man named Gerald Forsyth, who had an office in Columbus and who wore expensive suits and spoke with that particular confidence that makes ordinary people feel like they would be stupid to disagree. Sandra liked him immediately. He laid out the trust arrangement in clear, simple language. The house would go into a revocable living trust. Sandra and I would be the trustees. Kyle would be listed as successor trustee in the event of our incapacitation or death. The house would remain ours to live in. We would pay no additional taxes. The advantage was that when we passed, it would transfer immediately without going through probate, which saves time and money and spares the family from court. It sounded reasonable. It sounded like something a responsible family should do. I asked a few questions. Forsyth answered them. Sandra nodded along. Kyle sat in the corner of the office looking at his phone, but glancing up occasionally with that calm expression he always wore when he had already decided something. I signed. Sandra signed. We drove home. Kyle took us to dinner that night at the Italian place on 5th Street. He seemed happy. Sandra seemed relieved. I felt fine. A little tired. The way you feel after you have done something administrative that you had been putting off. That was 18 months before the cardinal on the fence post. I need to tell you about Dennis now, because he is part of this, and his part matters in a way I didn't understand until very late. Dennis is my younger brother. He is 63. We grew up together in the same house on the west side of Dayton with our mother and a father who was there until he wasn't. Dennis and I were always close, the way brothers who go through hard things together become close. We had each other's backs. We moved in the same direction even when life pulled us to different towns. When our mother got sick in 2011, Dennis and I took turns driving to Dayton every weekend. We split the cost of her care home. We were together when she passed. I cried on his shoulder in the parking lot of that hospital, and he held me up and said she knew she was loved. And I believed him because I needed to. Dennis had borrowed money from me 3 times over the years, not huge amounts. The biggest was $14,000 in 2016 when he had a bad year with his landscaping business and couldn't cover payroll. I gave it to him without a promissory note because he was my brother. He paid most of it back over about 2 years. There was still a small balance that we never formally settled. I never pushed it. I didn't think I needed to. What I didn't know was that Dennis and Kyle had been talking to each other regularly without telling me. I found out about those conversations in the worst possible way. Not through a confrontation, not through someone telling me. I found out through a letter. The letter that was in that envelope by the coffee maker on the morning I saw the cardinal. It was from a law firm in Columbus, not Forsyth's firm, a different one. The letter informed me that I was being notified of a petition filed in Franklin County Probate Court regarding the administration of a trust established in my name. The petitioner was listed as Dennis Decker, my brother. The letter used words like mismanagement and undue influence and improper fiduciary conduct. I had to read it 3 times before the words started to make any kind of shape in my mind. My brother was suing over my own trust, my own house, the house I had bought in 1989 and paid off by 2004 and lived in and painted and repaired and poured 30 years of my life into. Dennis was claiming that Kyle had exercised undue influence over me when the trust was established.
That I had been manipulated. That the trust was improperly structured to benefit Kyle at the exclusion of other family members. Other family members. That phrase knocked around in my head for a long time. I sat down at the kitchen table. My coffee got cold. I read the letter again. The cardinal was gone from the fence post, but I looked out there anyway, like it might still be sitting there, like some kind of sign I should have paid more attention to. I called Kyle. He picked up on the second ring, which he almost never did. I told him what the letter said. There was a pause on his end. Not the pause of a man who is surprised, the pause of a man who is calculating how much to tell you. He said he had been waiting for this. He said Dennis had been threatening to file for months. He said he could explain everything, but that I needed to trust him. I need you to trust me. Those 5 words from a man I had loved and raised and sacrificed for felt like a stone dropping into deep water. I heard them, but I also heard something else underneath them, something I couldn't name yet. I asked him to come over. He said he would come on Saturday. It was Tuesday. 4 days of sitting in that quiet house, reading that letter over and over, and searching legal terms on my phone, and calling Sandra twice, and getting voicemail both times, because she was in Columbus visiting her sister and not picking up, which she said later was because the battery was low, which I accepted because that's what you do when you have 40 years of trust built up with someone. You accept the small explanations, even when something in your chest says, wait. Kyle came on Saturday. He brought coffee from the drive-thru, and we sat at the kitchen table where I had read the letter 5 days earlier. He opened a folder, same kind of folder as before, same careful preparation. He laid out documents, and he began to talk, and I listened. And slowly, a picture began to form that I was not expecting. He told me that our mother's estate had never been fully settled, that there was a property in Dayton, a small rental house that had been in the family and that had been passed down informally, and that Dennis had been managing since our mother died, but had never formally transferred, and had been collecting rent on for 14 years without distributing any of it to me as the other heir. He showed me documents, rent records, a deed, correspondence between Dennis and the original tenant, letters that Dennis had sent to an accountant in Dayton that Kyle had obtained through a records request. 14 years. Dennis had been collecting roughly $900 a month from that property, which worked out to something close to $150,000 that by rights should have been split between the two of us. I sat with that number for a long time. Then Kyle told me the rest of it. He told me that Dennis had found out about the family trust we had set up, and that Dennis had panicked because if I had a properly structured estate plan, then any claim he had over the Dayton property through informal arrangements would be exposed and challenged. So Dennis had filed the petition to invalidate my trust, not because he was protecting me from Kyle, but because he was protecting himself from being caught.
I asked Kyle how he knew all this. He said he had hired a private attorney about 8 months earlier when he first noticed the discrepancies in the property records. He said he hadn't told me because he didn't want to hurt me. He said he knew how much Dennis meant to me, and he didn't want to bring me something that might destroy me until he was sure. I looked at my son across the kitchen table, the boy I had taught to drive in that parking lot, the boy I had walked down the fishing path at Harlan Creek every April for 20 years. I looked at him, and I tried to find the lie in his face. I tried to find the angle, the manipulation, the scheme. I had been so ready to find it, so ready to discover that this man I had trusted was the one who had taken from me. I had been constructing that betrayal in my mind for 4 days, had already half-written the story of it, had already started to grieve it. What I found instead was something I didn't know how to hold. He pulled out one more document. It was a draft of a letter he had written to Dennis 6 months earlier. A private letter, not a legal filing, not a threat. A letter from a son to his father's brother, asking him to come clean and make it right before it went any further. A letter that said, "I don't want to hurt Ray. I just need you to do the right thing." Dennis had never responded. I put the letter down. I looked out at the backyard, the oak tree, the fence post. No cardinal this time. I asked Kyle why he set up the trust the way he did, with himself as successor trustee. I wanted to hear him answer that, because it was the thing that had frightened me most, the thing that had made the whole arrangement feel like a net being drawn around me. He said he thought about that a lot. He said he should have explained it better. He said the advisor recommended it because Marcus and Jolene were both out of state, and he was the one who was close by. He said it wasn't about control, it was about logistics. He said he should have made sure I fully understood what I was signing, and that he was sorry he hadn't done that better. He said sorry in the same way his voice broke slightly in that old parking lot when he was 16 and reversed the truck into a fire hydrant. The same catch in the throat, the same honesty behind it. I sat in that kitchen for a long time after he left. I didn't know what I was feeling exactly. It wasn't relief, it wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't even clarity. It was something more complicated and more painful than any of those things. Because here was the truth that I had to face. I had believed the worst about my son before I had asked him a single question. I had read that letter on a Tuesday morning, and by Tuesday afternoon, I had convicted him in my mind. I had spent 4 days building a case against the one person in my life who had actually been trying to protect me. And I had done it so easily, so naturally, like the suspicion was already living inside me, just waiting for something to attach itself to. Why was that? That was the question that kept me up for weeks afterward. Why was it so easy to believe Kyle had betrayed me? I think part of it was guilt. My own guilt. Because I knew I had never been the father I should have been to him in those early years. I worked too much and I was distracted, and there were stretches of his childhood where I was physically present but emotionally somewhere else entirely, thinking about money or the job or the next thing on the list. And somewhere underneath all those years of trying to do right by him, there was a small voice that said, "You didn't earn this love. You didn't earn this loyalty." And some part of me was always waiting for the moment when he would confirm that.
When he would look at what I had and decide that taking it was fair exchange for everything I had withheld from him as a boy, that voice was wrong. I know that now. But it was very loud in those 4 days. Now I have to tell you about Sandra. Because what I found out about Sandra did not come with a saving explanation on a Saturday morning. What I found out about Sandra was the thing that actually broke me. While all of this was happening, while I was reading legal letters and meeting with Kyle and starting to understand what Dennis had done, Sandra was not in Columbus visiting her sister. Not the second time. The third time she went, she was not there either. I didn't know this for certain until March of the following year, about 3 months after the legal situation with Dennis had started to get sorted out. I had no reason to suspect Sandra of anything. We had been married for 41 years by that point. She was 66. She had her routines and her friends and her book club and her sister in Columbus. We had settled into the kind of marriage that long marriages become. Not passionate, not electric, but comfortable and familiar and real in the way that only time can make something real. Or so I believed. What I found was not dramatic. There was no lipstick on a collar, no motel receipt. What I found was a name I didn't recognize in her phone. Not a contact name, but a name in a text thread. The thread was open when I picked up her phone by accident, thinking it was mine. We had the same case on both phones because Emma had given us matching cases as a Christmas gift that year. I picked it up and the screen was already lit, and there was a name at the top of an open message thread, and below it was a message that said, "I miss you already," and it had been sent 2 hours ago. She was in the shower. I stood in the bedroom holding that phone for about 30 seconds. Then I put it down exactly where it had been and went and sat in my truck in the garage. I sat there for a long time. The garage was dark, except for the strip of light under the door from the kitchen. I could see the pegboard on the wall where all my tools hung. Level, circular saw, tin snips, wood chisels, everything in its place. I had organized that pegboard over 20 years, added to it slowly. It was one of the things in my life that had stayed exactly the way I arranged it. I didn't cry, not yet. I just sat there with my hands on the steering wheel going nowhere. His name was Gerald, not Forsyth the attorney, a different Gerald. He was 62 years old and he lived in a suburb of Columbus, and he had been Sandra's first serious relationship before she met me in 1981. She had told me about him once, years ago. She said it hadn't worked out. She said she had loved him, but it wasn't the right time, and they had drifted apart. She told me that story in the first year of our marriage, when you still share all the old stories with each other. I had filed it away as ancient history, something from before my time that had no claim on my life. I found out later that they had reconnected at a class reunion in 2019, right before everything else started happening, that the Columbus visits to her sister were sometimes real and sometimes not, that the book club on Thursday evenings occasionally ended early, and she spent the remainder of those evenings somewhere else. I found all of this out over the course of about 6 weeks of paying attention in a way I had never paid attention before. Not by going through her things, I want to be clear about that. I was not the kind of man who went through his wife's drawers. But when you are looking for something, it has a way of becoming visible. I confronted her in the kitchen on a Sunday evening in early April. The kids were not there. The house was very quiet. I had cooked dinner, which I almost never did. I made spaghetti because it was the only thing I could make reliably. We sat down and ate for a while, and then I said her name in a certain way, and she looked up at me. And whatever was in my face told her that I knew before I said a single word. She didn't deny it. That was the thing. I had expected denial. I had expected a fight. What she gave me instead was this terrible quiet thing that was worse than anything she could have said. She put her fork down, and she folded her hands on the table, the way she used to fold her hands in church, and she told me the truth. She said she was sorry. She said she hadn't meant for it to go this far. She said she had been lonely for a long time. Not physically lonely, emotionally lonely. That somewhere in the last decade she had started to feel like I was more attached to the house and the tools and the work than I was to her. That she had stopped feeling seen. That when Gerald came back into her life, he looked at her in a way that she had forgotten she needed. I listened to all of this. Every word. I didn't yell. I didn't slam a fist on the table. I just listened. The way an old man listens to something he can't change. And when she was done, I asked her one question. I asked her if she wanted to go. She looked at me for a long time, and then she said, "I don't know. I need to tell you what those 3 words cost me. Because 41 years is not just time, it is a whole architecture of a life. It is the births of children and the deaths of parents and the mortgage payments and the Sunday mornings and the arguments about money and the making up after the arguments and the trips to the beach when the kids were small and the hospital waiting rooms and the holidays and the ordinary Tuesday evenings when nothing happens at all except you are both there. And that is enough. All of that lives in 3 words. I don't know." All of that was balanced on the edge of those 3 words. She didn't go. Not immediately. We went to counseling for about 4 months. A woman named Dr. Wren with an office on Oak Street and neutral beige walls and a white noise machine in the hallway. Sandra and I sat on opposite ends of her couch and said things to each other that we had never said in 40 years. Some of those things were salvageable, some were not. She ended contact with Gerald in May. She told me she had ended it. I chose to believe her. I still don't know with certainty what the complete truth is, and I have made a decision not to spend the rest of my life trying to excavate it. That decision was the hardest thing I have ever made. Harder than any court document, harder than any letter from a law firm, harder than sitting in a dark garage with my hands on a steering wheel. The legal situation with Dennis came to a head in the fall. His petition was dismissed. His attorney withdrew once the rental property records came into evidence. Dennis called me in October. I let it go to voicemail. He left a message that was partly an apology and partly a justification, and I have listened to it exactly twice. The second time I deleted it. I have not spoken to him since. He came to Jolene's wedding last spring, and we were in the same room for 4 hours and said nothing to each other. I am not angry at him in the way I thought I would be.
I am just finished with him in a way that is quieter and more permanent than anger. Kyle and I had a conversation about 3 months after the Saturday kitchen meeting that I think about sometimes. We were driving back from picking up lumber for a small project he was doing. Just riding in my truck the way we had 100 times before. He asked me if I was okay. Not in the small talk way, in the real way. I said I was getting there. He said he was sorry the whole thing had put such a strain on me. I said he didn't have anything to be sorry for. Then he said something I wasn't expecting. He said he had always known that being my adopted son meant he had something to prove. That he had never once in his life taken my love for granted the way a biological child might. That he had always worked harder at being my son because some part of him knew it was a choice I had made. And that knowing it was a choice had made him more careful with it. More aware of what it meant. I had to look out the window when he said that. We were passing the old Kmart parking lot. The one where I taught him to drive. The pavement was cracked now and weeds came up through it. And the building was a Dollar General. Everything changes. Everything becomes something different than what it was. But that parking lot was still the same size and the same shape. And when I looked at it, I could still see the truck turning slowly in a big circle, with a 15-year-old kid gripping the wheel like it was alive.
I told him I loved him. I said it plainly, without any preamble or setup, the way you can say things to your children when you get old enough to stop being embarrassed about them. He said he loved me too. We didn't say anything else for a while. The radio played something low and country, and the road went on ahead of us the way roads do. Sandra and I are still married. We live in the house together. Some days are better than others. The counseling helped in the sense that it gave us language for things we had never named. What it didn't do was erase the knowledge. The knowledge lives in the house with us. It sits at the table when we eat dinner. It occupies a corner of every quiet room. I have made peace with that, the way you make peace with a scar. You don't pretend it isn't there. You just stop letting it be the only thing you feel. My brother's betrayal taught me something about money and what it does to family. About how a man can love his brother his whole life and still have a hidden calculation running underneath the love, like a leak under a floor. Dennis never thought of himself as a thief. I believe that. He told himself the rent money was fair compensation for managing the property. He told himself he was owed it for the years he had handled everything after Mom died. He had built a whole justification and lived inside it so long it had started to feel like the truth. That is the most dangerous kind of dishonesty. The kind that forgets it's dishonest.
Sandra's betrayal taught me something about marriage and what goes wrong in the silence between two people who stop truly looking at each other. I had not seen her, not for years. I had seen the familiar shape of her. I had heard the familiar sound of her. But I had stopped looking at her the way you look at someone when they matter. When she said she felt unseen, I wanted to argue with that. I wanted to say all the things I had done, all the years of providing, all the weekends of working. But that argument would have been about me, about defending myself. And what she needed was not a defense.
She needed the thing I had stopped giving her and didn't even know I had stopped giving. I don't say that to excuse what she did. I am not going to stand here and tell you that it didn't hurt me. It hurt me in a way I am still finding the edges of, even now. There are nights when I wake up at 2 in the morning and the hurt is fresh and specific and sharp, and I lie there in the dark next to her, listening to her breathe, and I feel something that is not quite love and not quite grief, but some strange cold compound of both. Then there is the thing about Kyle that I have to live with too. Not what he did, what I thought he did. The 4 days I spent building a case against him in my own head, the speed with which I assumed the worst, the son who had driven 3 hours in a snowstorm to help me when my furnace quit in 2018. The son who showed up every year on my birthday without fail, even when his marriage was struggling and his work was grinding him down. The son who kept a framed photograph of the two of us at Harlan Creek on his desk at work. That son. And I had him convicted in my mind by Tuesday evening. I asked Kyle later if he had known I suspected him. He said he had figured it out pretty quickly. I asked him how he felt about it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said it hurt more than he expected. Then he said, "But I understand why." He said that was the worst part. Understanding why. I live with that. Emma is 13 now. She texts me sometimes just to check in. Little things. "Grandpa, did you see the game last night?" "Grandpa, I made the honor roll again." "Grandpa, Mom said you might come for Thanksgiving." I write back every time, every single time, even when it takes me a few minutes to figure out the autocorrect. That girl is one of the lights. There are a few of them left. She is one of them. Marcus called me last month from Phoenix. We talked for an hour and a half, which is longer than we have talked in years. He asked me about the legal stuff, and I walked him through it, and he was angry at Dennis, the way only someone who wasn't there to absorb the slow damage of it can be angry, clean and hot and righteous. I told him to let it go. He said he was trying. Jolene doesn't know everything. I haven't told her about Sandra. That is mine to carry, and I have chosen to carry it inside the marriage where it belongs. Maybe someday. Not now. I still drink my coffee black every morning. I still watch the backyard through the kitchen window while it drips. The cardinal comes back sometimes. Not every day. Sometimes weeks go by and I don't see it. Then one morning it's there, on the fence post, and I stand at the window and watch it until it flies away. I don't know what I believe about signs. I never have been much for that kind of thinking. But I notice the bird. I notice it every time. I am 68 years old. I have a house that almost wasn't mine anymore. I have a marriage that almost ended and maybe still has its slow damage growing somewhere I can't see. I have a son who proved himself in a way that I wish had never been necessary. I have a brother I no longer speak to, and a wife who came back, and a granddaughter who texts me about baseball and honor roll. I have my tools on the pegboard in the garage. I have my truck. I have the parking lot where I taught my boy to drive. I don't know how to sum up what I have learned from all of this. Every time I try to make it neat, it falls apart. Because life doesn't get neat. Not at 68. Not after 41 years of marriage and 31 years of construction work and 3 kids and a brother and all the ordinary accumulated weight of a real human life. It just keeps going, and you keep going with it. Or you don't. What I know is this. I almost lost my son because I was afraid he was just like everyone else, and he turned out to be nothing like everyone else. He turned out to be the kind of man who works in silence for 8 months to protect his father without asking for credit or recognition or anything in return. He turned out to be exactly the man I hoped I had raised him to be, and he had to prove it under circumstances no son should ever have to face. I lost my wife because I stopped seeing her, because I thought presence was the same as attention, because I thought working hard was the same as loving someone, because I was so busy building and providing and fixing that I forgot to just sit still and look at the woman across the table. I lost my brother to money, which is the oldest story in any family on earth, and somehow it still surprises you when it happens to yours. This is my life. This is what 68 looks like when you have really lived it and not just survived it. Some mornings it feels like enough. Some mornings it feels like a long, quiet room with nothing much in it. But then I drink the coffee, and I watch the yard, and sometimes the bird comes back, and that has to be something. That has to count for something.
It is from Trevor's first Little League season. He is 9 years old and he is wearing his uniform, which was red and white and too big in the shoulders the way uniforms always are on little kids. He is holding a bat and squinting into the sun and grinning with 2 missing teeth. I am crouched next to him with my hand on his shoulder, and my face is the face of a man who does not know yet what any of this is going to cost. I look at that picture sometimes and I don't know what I feel. It's not hate, I can tell you that clearly. After everything, I do not hate my son. I don't know if that makes me weak or just old, maybe both. But what I feel when I look at that picture is something more complicated and quieter than hate, something that doesn't have a clean name. The feeling of a man who loved something with everything he had and watched it become unrecognizable and still cannot stop loving the version that used to exist. The picture stays on the wall. I don't know what I would do with it if I took it down. That is where I am. That is who I am now. A man in a parking lot apartment on Crocker Street, with one picture on the wall and a company that carries his name, but not his voice. A man who built something out of nothing and watched his own blood dismantle it with the tools he taught them to use. The phone sits quiet most evenings. Sometimes I look at it and wait for something I know is not coming.
Then I turn the light off and I go to sleep in a bedroom that still smells a little like a place no one has fully moved into. 38 years. 2 kids. 1 company. 3 acres. 1 picture on the wall with a 9-year-old boy grinning in a uniform that didn't fit. That's what's left.